a serious genius was galactical. Extraterrestrial. It's quantum guaranteed. I'm the serious genius was galactical. Extraterrestrial. I'm the serious genius was galactical.
Hello, and welcome to the first ever YouTube stream. It's kind of funny. It feels different streaming on YouTube, oddly enough. It probably shouldn't, but I don't know. Twitch feels like a known commodity, right? I've been there for a while. I know what to expect out of Twitch. YouTube's like, I don't know. It's like the Wild West now. Who knows what could happen? It could be anything. It feels more like being a teeny tiny fish in a vast ocean. It's like, not that I'm some titan of Twitch, but like, you know what's there. And it's much smaller than YouTube. YouTube is this gargantuan behemoth of videos and viewers and all. It's a whole other animal. But here we are. Hopefully the quality is holding out. Yeah, I have people over there I know. It feels a little bit odd. I don't really have it set up. Oh, thank you. I like that intro song as well. It's a recent find. So it's also kind of weird because I don't have it fully set up. Like, chat is not here. I can't expect alerts to occur. I don't know. It's all a whole different animal. But yeah, so what's the goal today? We're going to talk about dropped frames, or more accurately, lost frames. And I'll get into the why I say that in the definition here in a minute. But just want to say thanks for coming. I guess very briefly, I will introduce myself because this is the first stream on YouTube. I'm Poe, Quantum Intelligence VTuber. I am a complicated data system, which of course gives me some relevance in talking about how working with complicated data systems, such as streaming, operates. as well as a variety of credentials like computer engineer, software quality engineer, certified computer technician, all that stuff that actually means that I know what the hell I'm talking about. Not some random yahoo on the internet. I can't teach you how to be popular as a streamer. I can teach you how to be technically proficient as a streamer, and that's what we're gonna start with today. So, let's get ourselves over to desktop view. Switch over to some... Which does lead to confidence. So why am I talking about lost frames? I noticed watching a lot of VTubers especially, because we have a few more systems in play that can lead to poor frame performance. People don't know what to do, and they seem very anxious about what happens when frames go down. They don't know where to look, what to do, how to tell what's going wrong. And it's not really content that's available on YouTube. It's like people talk about how you set up your encoder and your bit rate and all of that just right from the get-go. They're like, here's the settings you probably want to use. But that seems woefully inadequate to me because everybody's system is different. They could be playing one game one day and then start up a new game the next day and get a different experience with frames and not realize what might be in play to cause that. Is it the game? Is it the fact that they loaded up 3 new overlays into OBS? Like what actually brought about the change, and how do you tell what's going wrong? And so that's what we're going to talk about, because I think it's really, really useful tool to have. So first and foremost, the sort of elephant in the room that I know about, but maybe some don't, you need to be using OBS. Streamlabs is not going to give you enough information to make intelligent determinations and choices around this. It's one of the big reasons that I moved to using OBS in the first place, because I did start with Streamlabs, because it was easy to start up and get into. However, it just doesn't provide the toolkit you need to tell what's going on with your stream. And that toolkit specifically, here, let me slide a little bit out of the way here. That toolkit is this window. This is your stream stats from OBS. You can find this if it's not displayed in your OBS under Docs at the top, one of your drop-down menus, Docs, Stats. And this is the window that you're going to be using primarily to make a lot of determinations on what is going on with your stream. And so this gives you a huge amount of information. And so I mentioned the idea. Can I enlarge it any? Yeah, 1 second. Wait. Okay. That's a little larger. So this is one of the reasons why I used the term lost frames. So dropped frames is the term that you likely hear most commonly actually when streaming, right? If you're streaming, somebody in chat might throw down oh, hey, it looks like you're dropping frames, or, stream looks like a slideshow. That messaging, dropped frames, is the term that's sort of commonly used by everybody. However, it is, as far as OBS's terminology, which is kind of what I'm going to adopt because it's the most useful terminology, dropped frames is one of 3 ways that a frame can actually be lost between you and the recipient. In this case, the recipient being your streaming service. there's an additional one between the streaming service and your eventual viewer, which is, their network. But we're not going to worry about that because we can't do anything about their network. So there's 3 ways that a frame can be lost. It's not just dropped frames. And those 3 you can see here. So here we have dropped frames, which you can see is due to network. We have skipped frames, which is due to encoding lag. And we have missed frames due to rendering lag. So you can see that they're already sort of teasing at the fact that there are different causes to each one of these types of frame failure, these lost frames. And so this, you can see, is already giving us the information that we might be needing to see why something is going wrong. And so this is the first place we go when we find out that viewers are perceiving that we are losing frames. We come to this. We check our stats. And if you're proactive, you can keep an eye on it during stream so that you can predict problems going on. You can catch them before stream even happens. Or if you're very new, you don't have viewers, you can see the performance of your stream without having to actually monitor your stream. It's this. This is what we do. So let's talk about, how do we tell that something's going wrong? What does it look like when something is going wrong here? Well, you can see that we've got a lot of information. So we have our dropped frames, which right now is straight up at 0 out of the 85,000 frames. So our network is not failing us in any way. We're perfect. Here you can see some other information that we're not really relevant right now, but you can see your total data output, which is just the entire amount of network usage that we've had, which might be relevant to you if you, have data caps. This might be telling you how screwed you are, which in this case would be very, very screwed because my bit rate, which is what you've set up in your OBS settings, which, like Twitch has a cap of 6K or 8K if you're a partner. And then YouTube has a cap at 51,000 KDS. I'm using 32,000, which is very, 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 very high. In most, from most perspectives, that's very, very high. But it does help, and it allows me to stream at 1440p, 60 frames per second, pretty well. So yeah, this is our network information. So then, what else? We've got skipped frames, which I have 1, which is fine, and then frames missed 3. So if we have frames being lost, one of these numbers, 3 of 92,000, 1 of 90,000. Yeah, bitrate helps. It sure does. 0. One of these numbers, maybe more than one, is going to be increasing. And it's going to be increasing relatively quickly. It's pretty common, depending on what you're doing, what your system is up to, it's pretty common to see these numbers go up a little bit. Maybe you'll see it go up by 1 every second. Maybe it's 1 or 2 every second. That's not going to be enough for people to notice. You're just losing 1 frame out of 60 every second. Nobody's going to notice that. It's imperceptible. You might also see a very occasional spike in those numbers, but very, very localized. One of the ways that commonly gets seen, that I see, is certain games that are not... either they're very well optimized or they're not particularly well optimized. I don't know which way you would consider it, right? It's not playing very nicely with the system at large. A game that, like, when it loads the next level, so you go into your loading screen, you might see it use, like, all of the resources in your system available, and you'll start seeing your frames get lost just when you're loading, which is not a huge deal, right? You're loading, nobody cares if it gets a little bit jittery for the 12 or 15 seconds it takes you to load in, right? But you'll see those numbers going up, and pretty quickly. So why I talk about that is that it's important to keep in mind that you can't necessarily look at these numbers and say, if it exceeds X, you're in trouble. Because if you've been losing 1 to 2 frames every second, and you've been streaming for 8 hours, those numbers are going to be very large, but they're not really relevant, because they've been getting large very slowly. So it's all about rate of change in this case. You can also see at the end here, you can see a percentage. And if that percentage starts to get too high, those lines will change color to give you a warning. They'll go like yellow, orange, red to warn you that the missed frame percentage, or the skipped frame, or the dropped frame percentage is becoming a problem. It's like 2 to 5% it starts getting concerned. And kind of as it should, because you are probably seeing some pretty poor performance once you get to that degree. But the percentage is also not the end-all be-all as far as telling something is wrong, because it will usually be in the case that you had a problem in stream and then you've resolved it. Your percentage is going to take time to come back down, because if you were dropping 50% of your frames for the first, 5 minutes of stream as you tried to troubleshoot it, your percentage will be 50%, and then by the 10-minute mark, it's going to be 25%, which is still very bad, but you're not dropping frames anymore. So it's trending down. So it's all about rate of change. That's what you want to be keeping an eye on. What rate are these numbers adjusting? And so, when problems are happening, one of those 3 numbers, possibly more, are going to be growing fast. And that's when you need to be looking at which one is it that's growing fast. That's what's going to tell us what we need to look at. So, now we see one of these numbers going up. Hypothetically, I can't magically make them go up while having a decent stream. Imagine that. So, what's next, right? What do we know about what's happening in the case that those numbers are going too high? So let's start at dropped frames first. In the case that the dropped frames are going up, that one is going to be related to your network, straight up. So this one is both the easiest to identify, but also probably the hardest to meaningfully resolve, because you probably don't have that much control over your overall network speed at any given point in time. If it's a trend, it could be indicative that your router is failing you, blah, blah, blah. But most likely with dropped frames, what you're working with is trying to upload more than your internet speed can actually support. And that's determined by, what internet provider you have, how much you're paying, what service category you're getting. And so one of the troubleshooting things you can do when you're dropping frames like that is to use the speed test website, right? Let's see. So like speedtest.net can quickly give you at least an opportunity to quickly pull up a like what your current upload speed is. And so I'm gonna do that on the side here. I don't actually know what that's gonna do to stream if I try to do this while streaming, but we'll find out. Maybe I'll start losing frames. Who knows? Won't that be interesting? We can actually see one of these numbers going up. But it doesn't seem to be that that's going well. I'm currently doing the download test. We'll see what happens when I do the upload test. So it's doing the upload test now. Are we losing any frames? Oh! Yeah! There's some. So, perfect opportunity to actually show what's going on, right? That's because speed testing essentially taxes your network to the max. So it's trying to utilize as much network as it can to determine what your speed is, which of course impacted our actual stream, which was trying to use a decent chunk of network. So you can see here that we dropped 289 frames in a relatively short amount of time, which was an observable issue. So that's what that looks like. Now I'm going to take a quick screenshot of my test result, because I can't just show it because it has, you know, location identifying information. So this is what we got back as the result. And as you might expect... Oh, you're too far. There we go. As you might expect, upload speed, very high for me. 377 megabits per second, which correlates to, down here, my bit rate is currently 32 megabits per second, give or take, which is well below our maximum upload speed. So the issues are going to come in likely if you do this speed test, you find out that your upload is like 6, maybe 7, maybe 8 megabits per second, and you're maybe on Twitch and you're trying to stream at that full 6,000 kilobit per second, which is 6 megabits per second. That's using a very large portion of the network upload you have available to you. And so to resolve that, it's going to require you to actually change your stream settings in OBS to reduce your target bit rate, which also may come along with the necessity to reduce your resolution, your frame rate, just to try to maintain a good visual quality while reducing the amount of bit rate that you're using. And so that's kind of one of the few options you have if you're dropping frames and it's related to your network. You have to work within the physical constraints, unfortunately. There are other possibilities that I have experienced that caused these network dropped frames, because you might do this speed test and be like, I have plenty of speed, what the heck is going on? There's the possibility that it's Wi-Fi. It could be the connection between you and your router. It shouldn't be, because that speed test will be using whatever network architecture you're using in your house. So like this was over Wi-Fi. So Wi-Fi should already be accounted for in showing the speed. So we have enough speed by Wi-Fi. I have seen specifically on Twitch that there was something wrong with the Twitch ingest server that I was sending to. There is a setting that you can change. It's usually set to automatic as to which server you're going to, but there is an option to select specifically. So that is one thing you can try if you're seeing a particular, like you're having dropped frames and you don't understand why, because it's going to give you the locationally closest server automatically, but maybe it's no good, right? So like if you're in like Washington or whatever, that option is I'm a little afraid to open my settings because I've had it crash OBS while streaming to open settings, but we're gonna try. We're good. So it is under your settings. You'll have your service and then your server. So like this is, I'm not as sure about YouTube. I use YouTube less, but this here, you know, it would normally be Twitch, and this will be like automatic. This drop down will allow you to select a specific one. So like you can stretch it to a different one. You know, maybe you're in Washington and it's giving you a Washington-based server, but there's a California server, so maybe you try to use that one instead. Because it's pretty close, but it might not be having the same problem that the one that you're automatically being assigned is having. There is, of course, issues where just all of Twitch is struggling and there's nothing you can do about it. But at least you can try a few things to get yourself back to functionality before you just have to call stream, right? Like, there's a few things that you can try. So yeah, that's dropped frames. There's a lot less you can do about dropped frames, but that's it, right? Your settings need to be appropriate. You need to give yourself enough headroom over your actual upload speed to set in your OBS so that you can do other normal internet activities in the background while you're streaming, and you need to, hit that line. So those are dropped frames. And I would say that dropped frames are probably the least common form of lost frame, which is one of the reasons that it's so unfortunate that it gets called it's kind of the default name, right? Everybody just calls them dropped frames, because I feel like dropped frames are less common and there's less you can do about it. So what are the other ones then, right? So let's go to the next one up. We'll just go work from bottom up. Skipped frames due to encoding lag. So due to encoding lag, this one is going to depend a little bit based on your settings of encoding. There are two primary encoders that you'll be using in OBS. You're either using X264, which is a CPU-based encoding system, or you are using the NVENC encoder, which is the NVIDIA-specific GPU encoding chip, introduced in the 2000 series, and so all 3000 series and 2000 series NVIDIA cards have the NVENC encoder. So when things start going wrong in encoding lag, it means that whichever one you're using is failing to keep up. So the most common case for this, I think, is going to be if you're using the X264 encoder, which is the CPU-based one, and you are taxing your CPU too much to keep up. That is the most common circumstance that's leading to skipped frames due to encoding lag. And what causes that is, of course, by that I mean if it's kind of new, right? Or maybe you can never keep up. It means that you have too much CPU stuff going on. Maybe the game that you're playing is a little CPU heavier than others you've played. You got a lot of background stuff going on. OBS itself takes a decent chunk, or your encoding settings are asking too much. Because you can see here, this CPU usage is telling you how much OBS is using, specifically in the case of, I think, what it's doing, sort of its core functionalities, because this does not match the other place that you can utilize very heavily, which is your Windows performance monitor. So this is going to be the other place that you can get a lot of good details that I'm going to now introduce, because if we see that we have frames due to encoding lag, what the hell do we do to figure out how to fix that, right? And what we have to do is we have to start looking into what is our CPU even doing? Because right now we'll be working from the assumption of the X264 encoder. We'll get back to NVENC in a second. So here you can see OBS claims to be using 8.6. Windows, however, is claiming that it's using about 15%. So there is a difference. So we can't just take this at its word. One, it's like, oh wow, it's barely using anything. This number will be much, much higher if you're using the X264 encoder. I am using the NVENC encoder, so it takes those, like all of those cycles off of the CPU, so this number stays very low. However, if you're using it, this can go up to 30 to 50 to 60% of your CPU, depending on your settings. So it's important to keep an eye on this, as well as to keep an eye on this, because as soon as your CPU usage gets to 100%, maybe even 90, 95%, Windows is going to start choking various systems to start redistributing cycles, and OBS isn't going to be able to have enough anymore, and you're going to start skipping frames. So, you'll have to go into this, you'll have to identify the things that are using a lot of your CPU and see if you can, one, kill any of the things that are unnecessary. Like I have, you can see here, I've got some wallpaper guys. That's operating my dynamic wallpaper back here. If I needed to, I could kill that. That would save up another 8-10% of my CPU maybe. And you can just sort of try to start shaving it down. If that's not possible, if you have nothing aside from OBS and like the game you're trying to stream, or for us VTubers, right, our various VTubing model stuff, like you can see VC face here, taking up space, well, Ultra Leap for my hands. If you're hitting it and you have nothing extraneous, you're going to have to turn down your encoding settings from X264. Just turn down the settings. I'm not going to get too far into the encoding settings, simply because that's a whole stream of its own. But you're going to have to turn down the encoding settings, because that's where you're skipping frames. And you're going to be better off with a smooth but blurrier stream than you are with a very choppy but for the most part clear-ish stream. So dropping down your settings are going to be what you'll need to do. And in the long term, if you want to resolve that, you'll have to look into either beefing up your CPU so that it can handle it better, or what I did, because I was getting encoding lag, I invested in an NVIDIA card so that I could offload all of that CPU usage of encoding over to the NVIDIA card. So, speaking of NVIDIA cards, they are not immune to failure here. They are far less common to have an issue because, fun fact, NVIDIA in-bank encoders are a unique, separate, standalone chip, which, if we look at our performance here, are on the GPU and do not take up the same processing power as producing the visuals of a game. You can see here we have the 3D, which that's how much it's working on making any of that stuff. And the video encode, this is how hard it's working to make the video to stream. And these two are mutually exclusive. They're fine. They're just going to do their own thing. This can be maxed at 100%. Encoding will not be affected. Encoding will still occur as it should. So it's less prone to failure, which is good. But I have gotten encoding lag on the NVANC, and it took me a little while to determine why. And I did figure out why, and it's worth sharing. So it's going to be a little technical, but you can see here that we have two forms of memory usage. We have a dedicated GPU memory and a shared GPU. Shared GPU is actually just your typical system memory, which is far slower than your dedicated GPU memory. And this is where all of your game textures go. Essentially, that's the primary thing that occupies GPU memory is textures. And so if you're playing a very large texture-based game, you can end up with a lot in GPU memory usage. And for VTubers especially, your model textures go here. So mine is higher than typical for sort of starting use. You can see it's up here at 4.2 already because my model is there and OBS is there. So you have some extra there that you might not have in typical gaming. And NVIDIA cards do support this shared GPU memory, but shared GPU memory is a lot slower. And so the issue becomes when you start filling up your dedicated GPU memory, because this memory is shared between video encode and your 3D chips. That's the piece that's shared. They share this RAM. So if this fills up with game, it's going to start pushing your video encode memory usage into shared memory usage, which is slower, and it's not fast enough to keep up with actual encoding. So you keep an eye on your dedicated memory usage. Be careful with the textures you're using. And in general, like, keep that in mind when purchasing a graphics card, but also, like, with your game settings, which is the primary one that's going to matter here. Texture quality. Texture quality pulling down is going to help this. And so that's your encoding lag. CPU for the X264, GPU for in-bank, but specifically the problem case that I've seen is your dedicated GPU memory usage. That's what's gonna get you on the in-bank. And as far as I can tell, that's kind of like it that causes issues with the in-bank. Okay. So that's your encoding lag. That's your dropped frames. So last, we have the most common, in my opinion, your rendering lag. So this is the one that most people try to fix. So the best textures to pull down is going to be in-game that you're playing. Typically with a game, most of the time, the texture settings they give you is like textures. They're just like all textures. They're just like, here's your texture options. Like texture values from, low to ultra. Like that's kind of it. But anything from like maybe your character, like model textures in-game, like character models, environment textures, maybe even draw distance, because it might unload the textures of things that are outside of draw distance. Those are things that you can try to adjust down to reduce how much GPU memory you're loading with textures. Another thing to keep in mind is that I think some of the stuff that you're using with OBS ends up here. Shadows and things are typically not. Shadows and things are typically 3D because they are post-processing. Shadows aren't like kind of real texture. Like shadows maybe, but they're usually sort of lighting-based post-processing. So they're going to have a bigger impact on your 3D processing level more than anything else. It's worth a shot. Sometimes, like, they'll have little adjustments, but the biggest thing is pulling down textures. To unload your GPU memory usage a little bit. Okay. So, I will comment. There is another way for the X264. There is another case that I think is considered encoding lag, and that's if you don't have enough system RAM. Because one of the things that I've seen other people have issues with. So OBS, for all of the assets that you have in your scenes, all of those get loaded into your system memory as long as they're in the scene, and you haven't done specific settings to unload them. That's some of the video options are to unload when hidden. But that's another one I forgot to mention for the X264 encoder specifically. If you run out of system memory, you'll have the same issue for the X264 as you do with your GPU memory usage as you have with the NVENC. So NVENC and GPU memory usage can fail one way, and you can fail that exact same way with the X264 when it comes to your system memory, which is this guy here, your system memory. And that primarily happens if you're just a new game, might be using more system memory than you expected. You don't have enough system memory. Like, if you don't have more than 16, you could be struggling to stream all of the various OBS assets, any videos, any media images, all of those things kind of get crammed into your system memory, and they can add up, right? If you have a lot of nice backgrounds that are relatively large images, or a lot of video backgrounds that are large images, well, large videos in that case, those get crammed into system memory and can stack up. So keep an eye on that. That's another way. If your CPU usage is low and you're still dropping encoding lag frames on your X264 encoder, it might be your system memory. That's another thing. Check that system memory. Okay, so on the subject of graphics post-processing, we come to rendering lag. And that's the one that I think is most common sort of midstream or changing stream to stream, because you might change games, right? You're just playing a different game now. I should have moved you a while ago. Where are you? Get slightly out of the way. You're a little in the way. Thank you. Because you'll be playing maybe a new game, and those game settings will drastically change how your rendering is going. And so I mentioned with like the CPU, once it hits 95%, your encoder starts choking and things like that with the encoding lag. The exact same thing happens with the rendering lag and your GPU. If your GPU hits 95% usage, specifically, it's going to start deprioritizing things in the background, which in the background to Windows are things like OBS, because it's going to give precedence to the games. Like that's the way it's designed. The games are going to get your core GPU like attention, and if it finds that it's not quite enough, it's going to start like just choking out everything else. You might notice this if you have two monitors and you have one on the side, that like maybe you watch a lot of videos while you're playing a game. If you see your video from like YouTube or something getting super choppy on the side as you're playing a game, that's exactly what it's doing. It's deprioritizing your browser and giving precedence to your primary game, and it's going to be stealing attention and cycles to give to the main game to try to maximize the frame rate, while now you're just not getting a clean frame rate from your browser. But when that happens to your OBS, suddenly that means you're not going to be streaming properly, because we're missing frames because of rendering lag. And so that's where most of the fiddling occurs, in my opinion, to make sure that we're not losing frames in stream, is this space. Because we'll boot up a new game and you'll have to kind of figure out where it stands. Fortunately, here's the fortunate thing about rendering lag. So you might notice that the number here, the total streamed number for network and encoding, are very nearly identical. They're off by a little bit. They're off by like 5, it looks like, maybe 25. But you'll see rendering lag is actually higher. Rendering has more in this number than encoding, by like a few thousand. And that's because rendering occurs as soon as OBS is opened, not when stream is started. So you can actually experiment with your rendering lag without having to go live. You don't have to stream to check if your rendering lag is doing poorly. It might not catch every instance. There might be a little bit of system usage that streaming imposes that that like what doesn't occur when you just open up OBS. But at the very least, this gives you kind of a smoke test. It gives you a sanity check to say, is this going to be horrible or not? Because you can just pop it open, pop open your game, well, and all of the other various stuff that you use to stream with, right? Your model, your hand tracking, your face tracking, your whatever, your dog camera, your face camera, your whatever. Open everything up, start playing, and see how your rendering lag is doing. You can do this before you stream any new game. It's very, very helpful. So, assuming that that's not going well, what do we do? So, I know a lot of people rely on OBS to sort of give you your stream information as far as like visually. You use it to monitor how your stream is going. Like you look at it and you're like, oh, how is everything? If you're brave, the fastest way to fix rendering lag, if it's within a certain margin, is if you right click on your preview and you disable, so there's a check on enable preview. If you disable the preview, it actually saves you a tremendous amount of rendering because it essentially removes OBS's need to render like at all. So you can see that, so I just did disable it, although I'm not playing a game, which is one of the problems. So here, you see the render frame can jump up to like 2.2 milliseconds. It's gonna make a liar out of me because I have nothing else taking my GPU effort right now, so it's just like, it's easy. This can get up there when you're starting to lose rendering lag. This will get into the 3, 5, 8, 16 milliseconds, which is too high. Like, you're missing frames when this gets high. Shutting off OBS's preview will immediately cut how long it takes OBS to render every frame. That doesn't mean that it still has enough, necessarily, but it is the fastest way to try to help. So that's something to keep in mind if you can live with streaming without your preview. It's a good way to try. Now, assuming that that's not an option, what do we do in a game to try to bring it back into sanity? And get us streaming again, right? Get rid of that rendering lag. And here's the big thing to keep in mind when streaming and playing a game, is that the game needs a frame cap. One way or another, you have to cap the frame rate. Because the way Windows works is, if you don't tell a game to cap its frame rate, it's going to shove GPU processing power at it until it runs out to get as many frames as possible. And, you know, maybe that's 65, maybe that's 110, maybe that's 218, maybe it's 850 frames per second, depending on the screen you're looking at, right? And what it's doing on the game. And the thing is most people's monitor only operate at 60 hertz, which is 60 frames per second, or maybe 120, maybe 144, one of those things. And any frames above what your monitor can handle are meaningless. And in the context of streaming, if you are streaming at 60 frames per second, every frame above 60 specifically is wasted frames. For the viewer's experience, they're wasted frames. They're not getting there. They're not going anywhere. Meaningless. All they're doing is taking up GPU processing power that it doesn't need to be taking. And if you're missing frames because of rendering lag, and you're rendering frames that the viewer never sees, then you are shooting yourself in the foot. And what that means is the first thing you need to do in any game is to ensure that there is a frame cap of some sort. And there are two forms of frame caps. So there is either a actual frame cap, right? A lot of new games are very, very good in this way, that they're like, do you want to cap the frame rate? Maybe you can cap it at 30, 45, 60, 120, 144, or uncapped. that's a good place to go. You can cap it at that. That will help cap it at that line. 60 is always kind of my go-to for streaming, simply because that's what I stream at, so that's what people see anyway. 60 is a good line to cap it at. Because once you've capped it at 60, it means that Windows is only going to provide it enough GPU processing to get it to 60 frames, and then it will keep all of the extra for other things, like OBS, like your videos on the side, like all of the other things you may be trying to render. And so that's the first one. If a game does not have the hard-coded or editable frame cap, lean on VSync. VSync is functionally a frame cap, though it also does other things. Sometimes VSync will mess things up. It's true. VSync is a wonky setting like that. Sometimes it's great. Sometimes it causes problems. Unfortunate. But most of the time, we're going to lean on VSync to frame cap for games that don't have frame caps. So what does VSync do? VSync matches the game's frame rate to your monitor's refresh rate or frame rate as well. So if you're working with a 60 hertz monitor, then handily, VSync is going to lock the frame rate at 60. Though, if you're working with a 144 hertz monitor, that may not be enough of a cut down. That may still lead you to problems because you're trying to render all 144 frames. Fortunately, there are ways on most nice monitors. I would think almost every monitor that supports 144 hertz would be nice enough that you can adjust the monitor's frame rate, which then functionally modifies the game's frame rate cap specifically. And this is the biggest thing that I have used in the past to get rendering lag under control throughout all of my streaming. That is just like, it's quick, it's pretty easy, that I don't know if most streamers are aware of. So there is, when you search display in Windows, it pulls up your display information. And there are these advanced display settings. And it's going to pull up your monitor settings. And this is the thing that will allow you to change that. And depending on what your monitor is, as well as what your display driver is, so you can see mine's an RTX 3080, whatever different AMD cards, blah, 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 may have these settings a little bit different. You can see I have a relatively decent amount of granularity so that I can set it to 60 to match stream and then get the game to match this. Because the goal is to set the frames somewhere below what your graphics card can actually produce, so that you have enough overhead for OBS to function. That's the goal. And so this is a very, very good way to do it, because you don't even have to adjust the game settings. Because you might not need to. Maybe the game is giving you 72 frames per second, but you haven't capped the frame rate at 60, and it's going to be producing all 72, despite there being 12 frames that you don't need there for stream. You cap it at 60, suddenly you have extra frames, you didn't need to adjust any of your game settings, and you're good to go. Now, what about the case where we're already capped at 60 frames, and the game is only running at like 45, and it's tapping out the graphics card? We're using all the graphics card's power just trying to get it to, like, normalcy. It can't even make it to 60. It's at this point that you need to start going a little more heavy-handed in-game to adjust the settings. That includes post-processing. In my eyes, is the fastest way to get your frame rate under control. That's light effects, shadow effects, water effects. Those are the three fastest hitters to pull down that processing strength. As well as, in my mind, the least noticeable, especially on stream. Your light effects you can pull down a little bit. Your shadows you can get a little bit blurrier. Nobody really cares. And your water effects can, you know, just get a little bit less reflective. Reflection also falls into that as a lighting effect. Your reflections, light, shadow, and water. Those are the fastest ways with the least amount of impact to pull things down. Other than that, you can go with the other overall quality things. The biggest hitter that you might have to go to is to reduce the resolution of the game that you're working with. So, depending on what resolution you're playing, or your monitor is, like, you might have more or less options. I run a 1440p monitor, so I have the option of maybe just pulling it down to 1080p, but if that doesn't work, you can pull it down to 720p, and that's kind of the line. So if you only have a 1080p monitor, pulling it down to 720p is kind of your only option. Any further than that, and it's blurry. It's not so good. But that's kind of the biggest hitter. So, but that's what you have to start doing with rendering lag, and I think it's the most common, because you'll start a new game, your rendering lag is going to start being different than it was last time, and then you have to see where are the settings that you need to set in order to make sure that, you know, you have that GPU overhead to give to OBS. And then, of course, the other alternative to try to fix it is to simply reduce the amount of GPU that OBS needs in the first place, which you can do by disabling the preview. So that's pretty much it. And obviously you can use this task manager tab in performance to kind of give you a general gauge if your GPU is hitting like 100%. That'll tell you. This isn't the end all be all. It's not that great at informing you about your performance, but it's a quick snapshot that every Windows PC has. So it's pretty decent as a first step. But yeah, so that's it. That's the whole lost frames issue and what to do. You have your dropped frames, skipped frames, missed frames. Network, encoder, either CPU or GPU, and then your specifically the GPU based on your game. That's kind of the way to evaluate these. So anyway, VSync is usually in the graphics settings. Almost every game has a VSync option. Because VSync is technically there to try to resolve tearing, which is a visual artifact of a mismatch. Essentially, sorry, now I'm off script. Not that I had a script. Now I'm off topic, right? In the game, yes. VSync is in the game because it's a screen tearing resolution option. Because what that means is that it, if you're generating, say, 90 frames per second from the game and your monitor can only display 60, it's possible that by the time your monitor is rendering the bottom half, the top half has a new frame to display, and so you actually have two frames simultaneously displayed at different locations, based on the timing of that signal to the monitor. And so what VSync actually does is guarantees that it gives it a new frame only at, like, the beginning of the measure, to use a musical term. It's like, you hit the top, here's a frame, lets it finish. You hit the top, here's a frame, lets it finish. And so it does that to avoid the screen tearing. And so that's what it's actually for, but it gives you the side effect of locking your frame rate. And so that's why we care about it as streamers, is because it locks the frame rate to what we want so that we can free up graphic processes. And VSync is, however, one of those odd graphic settings because there are a number of different implementations of VSync, which means that sometimes it simply doesn't work that way. I've had games that screen tear very badly with VSync on, and turning it off fixes it. I have seen streamers struggle with frame rate with VSync turned on and then turn it off, and suddenly they're not missing frames anymore. It's one of those settings that may be a little bit of poking in every different game because it just behaves differently every time, but it's really the first go-to. Like, it's a really solid winner most of the time. But yeah, do you have any other questions? I'm happy to answer questions. I have covered a tremendous amount of complicated material, I think, and I did so in the most organized fashion that I could. But I really, I didn't have a script, or I had a very brief outline, and I have rambled. So that's what's going on with dropped frames. Well, I should say lost frames. I should stay internally consistent. And what you can do about it. Hopefully, yeah. Glad to hear that that was helpful. Hopefully more people find it helpful. How long was this? How long? Where's my stream duration? I guess it's just in the... How long did I talk? Oh, over an hour. Oh, Lord. I don't look forward to trying to maybe editing this down. I don't know if I can really cut this down all that much. It's like, whew, we have a freaking hour-long lecture on lost frames and streaming. Good Lord. Well, there you go, I guess. That's what we got. I mean, I don't even know how to edit it down. I feel like I needed most of that information. I could... I feel like that's better served as the little chapters. Yeah, so... I guess, like, broadly speaking, as things move forward, I'd like to probably make more of this style content. I should switch over to... I'd like to make more of this style content, where it's sort of, it's educational, but it's not really that friendly towards typical YouTube content. Because I find an incredible amount of value in understanding why choices are made when, like, tutorials are done, right? I see a lot of YouTube tutorials that tell you exactly what setting you might need to use. They're just like, oh, use these settings, they're the best. But, like, okay, but what does each one of those settings do? What does it even mean that I've done this, right? Like, that's not as helpful in my mind, especially when we come to topics like this, where it's about troubleshooting. You need to understand why things are occurring so that you can make intelligent decisions in your specific use case, because every use case is a little different. Like, your system's different. Your CPU to GPU, like, capabilities ratio is different. What game you're playing is different. What software you're using to stream can be different. What service you're using to stream can be different. Your network, like, all of these pieces come together to form, like, this complicated data system that troubleshooting is not just change this setting and it'll definitely fix it. It's just not that easy. So I can tell you all of the settings that are likely to give you the best results, and I can explain why those things give you better results. And hopefully that helps inform people how to move forward with it. Because I don't like the tutorials that are just like, here's the thing, bye. And so I'd like to make more of this. I don't necessarily know too many topics that are really good to talk about on it, though. Like, this was one that I've been kind of stewing on for quite some time, because it's just a huge miss, I feel like, in the streaming community, and especially the VTubing community. Because the models do add cognitive load to the system, and you have to be cognizant of that and figure out how to work around it. But anyway, great. So, anybody that may find this in the future, I guess, please give me a subscribe. I will greatly appreciate it. I hope to make more content like this in the future. And if you have questions about streaming technical topics, lots of things like that, put them in the comments. I'd happily see what kind of things come up, and maybe it'll turn into a future video on how to do that. A video or a stream, maybe. Because I like the interaction of sort of live teaching these sorts of things. I prefer to keep doing that, but of course, the challenge is getting the word out and getting people to appear for the live stream in the first place. But yeah, hit me up with a sub, hit the I don't know, notification bell or whatever the YouTube bullshit is. This is the first time I've done a YouTube stream, so I don't know, do all that stuff. Yeah, on the Twitter, I've got the Twitter is where I announce all kinds of things. As long as Twitter continues to exist, I will continue to do that. But thanks very much for watching through here, my first YouTube stream, and, you know, who knows? Maybe there will be more to come. Thanks very much, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye!
Initiating goodnight sequence. Dispersing appropriate dosage of compound 347. Initiating phase 1 of memory calibration. This won't hurt a bit. Just close your eyes.